the site was deliberately chosen to be so prominent, and also very visible to the Americans across the river, and a reminder of what happened a long time ago.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Stories of 1812 podcast. We're glad you could join us today for yet some more stories about the War of 1812 and the characters and people that were in it that we really do well in remembering. And today, my guest is Professor Wesley Turner. He taught history at Brock University for many years, from 1968 to 1998. He's written a number of books about the War of 1812. Wes, why don't you just flash them up so that people can see the cover? I think it's always the same cover, right? It's this camera right here. Yeah. The Astonishing General and the British generals in the War of 1812. And that's not all you've written. I mean, you wrote what, the War of 1812, the war that both sides won,
Yes.
and then another, I think, general compendium on the War of 1812.
Well, an earlier one for it was a school book.
Yeah.
Or,
Okay. And you've been on the board of the St. Catherine's Historical Society
oh, yes,
and the Ontario Historical Society, just
yes.
to give people a sense of your dedication
And the
to
friends of
history
and the friends of Fort George,
and
I
the Friends
must
of
add
Fort
too.
George.
Yes.
So welcome and thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge of the War of 1812. Um, we're here talk about Brock, but we're here to talk about Brock as a legend or the legacy of Brock. And in your preface to the book, The Astonishing General, you kind of confess your astonishment as a way of writing the book. You say, and among other things, you say he was admired by the American foes almost as much of it by his own. And he said, even more striking, you say, is how a British general whose military role in a 2.5 year war lasted less than 5 months. It doesn't fit with other historical figures that we remember. An unusual hero.
Now, I was asked in 2008 by my publisher Dundurn uh, to do a biography of Brock, and there hadn't been one for 30 years. So I thought, okay, well, it's time. And what would be different? Why would I write it? And I'd been thinking at that time about heroes and heroines in the War of 1812. And so I looked at, I thought I would take a look at Brock from that point of view. Why is he called a hero? After all, as you pointed out, he died very early in the war. It goes on afterwards, and there are major battles, and great threats continue to Upper Canada. Um, but Brock is remembered as the hero.
You ask someone about War of 1812 and they'll say Brock. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes. And he's the only officer from that war who has a monument, a university named after him, cities named after him, et cetera, et cetera. Now, why? And the Governor General Prevost, who you think would get some remembrance, it has none at all. There's no monument. He's buried in a graveyard in England, and there's a plaque that his widow had installed in Winchester Cathedral, and that's it. For the Governor General, who served throughout the war and had some successes as well as failures. Um, and none of the others you can mention. I can mention the others: Major General Sheaffe, Major Lieutenant General Drummond, and Major General de Rothenburg. Who's ever even heard of them?
Right.
Even though they fought in major battles, had some successes, but I remember at a conference, I asked a group of Canadian historians who won the Battle of Queenston Heights.
Hmm.
And they said, all of them said Brock.
Isn't that amazing? Because he didn't even survive the battle, and it was Sheaf that. What when you started investigating that and writing the book, what were some of the clues that you came across as to why this may be what is an apparent paradox, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, you're right. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, uh, um, I previously I had looked at his career before the war broke out, and so I had another closer look at that.
yeah, yeah.
And what I found is the way he dealt with his men, with his soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
um, which made it clear to them that he was concerned with their welfare, their lives. He tried to make them as easy as possible, um, and it was realized that the gap between the enlisted soldier and the officers was very wide.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Really
it
was
was
a
just,
class system,
oh,
wasn't it?
very
Yeah,
much a
yeah,
class system,
yeah.
yes. Um, but also, I could look at his political activity,
Mm-hmm.
um, especially in Upper Canada when he was the president beginning in September of 1811. And uh, the way he dealt with some dubious characters, people who had been opponents of the lieutenant
Like
governor.
Joseph Wilcox, maybe.
Joseph Wilcox,
Yeah,
a good example. Yes, he had dinner with Joseph Wilcox.
and got him to go to Six Nations and ask them to fight.
Yes.
Yeah,
Now
yeah,
at that time, there was no indication that Joseph Wilcox would join the American side,
yeah.
but he was a very important leading critic of the government, the previous Lieutenant Governor Gore, and you would expect this would happen with Brock, but no, he won his support, uh, and it's amazing how he could do that. But also the support of other people who had been opposing policies of the previous lieutenant governor.
Let let let's let's maybe just hit the pause button for a second because I'm sure you're right. There are all those things in there. Let's go back to a little bit about the cast of other generals in the War of 1812, which is the subject of your book, and maybe quickly look a little bit more of those people and how he compared to those people. Maybe if we use those folks, maybe we can draw things out more about him. So, for example, um, Major General Sheaf. Now, he was in the 49th with Sheaf, had known him for a long time, right? And technically, Sheaf was the guy who won the Battle of Queenston Heights. So if we compare the two, what is that, those differences, those stark differences between Sheaf and Brock that,
She previously had difficulties
yeah,
with the soldiers. In other words, they they some of the men blamed him, Chief. When Brock was not president, Chief was commanding the 49th Regiment at Fort George, for example, with um, not really taking their interests into account. And so this had led to plots against him, threats of desertion, threats of mutiny, which did not happen under Brock's command, but it happened more than once under Sheaf's command.
but Brock, so maybe
Mhm.
this is the heart of it and we were getting to it, but Brock still used army discipline. He
Oh,
didn't
yes.
fail to observe, the rules and regulations, but he was more flexible, or he showed concern, or he made sure the soldiers had supplies.
Well, yeah, yes,
Yeah.
those things. But he realized that the soldiers had a lot of spare time when they're simply on
Mm,
garrison duty. There's no fighting going on. And they would get into all kinds of mischief,
mischief.
as, if you pardon me, as soldiers may tend to do
Yeah.
in those days anyway. And so he wanted to allow them to engage in activities, say like fishing
Mm-hmm.
or even going hunting,
Yep.
as long as they supplied the ammunition
Sure.
for their muskets.
Right.
Where Sheaf was not that kind.
Mm.
He was much more concerned about discipline and
Mm-hmm.
order,
Mm.
um, and didn't seem to understand, the men's needs and their concerns and their families' needs and concerns, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was one other thing that he did, which was he circulated a lot with local populations. And he did that in Montreal, but when he came to Niagara, he didn't stop enjoying the company of women, nor did he fail to have relationships outside the military barracks and
Yes,
circulate with the local people.
yes,
Yeah.
that's yes, yeah. He certainly enjoyed balls and parties.
Hmm.
He made friends with Robert Nicol,
Robert Nickel.
or at
Yeah.
least let's say he recognized the talents of Robert Nicol, who
Hmm.
was just an ordinary shopkeeper,
Hmm.
and raised him up
To
in
quartermaster or something,
yes,
right?
quartermaster general
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
militia. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Again,
Uh,
tied in with his ability to read people
yes,
in the same way, he might be able to read the enemy. And I think you refer to that, the psychology or something you say. I
mhm,
quite don't have it here, but his psychological ability to read people in situations, whether they be residents or whether they be
mhm.
the enemy. He had a knack for that.
Here's another contrast.
Yeah.
Um, after Brock's funeral, Sheaf made a ceasefire, or
Hmm.
agreed to a
Mm.
ceasefire with the Americans
Yeah.
along the border.
Yeah.
And then he extended the ceasefire. And
Hmm.
some of his officers didn't understand, why is he doing this?
Hmm.
In fact, he instructed the commander at Fort Erie, if if they were attacked and couldn't defend, they would retreat. They should retreat. Now, he used the word retreat.
Hmm.
Brock would never use that word.
Yeah.
And immediately there's strong opposition to him. People began to wonder, does Sheaf have the backbone
Hmm.
to lead us in this, defending Upper Canada?
Hmm.
So they begin to, you see some doubts towards the end of 1812 in Sheaf's ability really to organize and galvanize the defense of Upper Canada the
And
way Brock had done.
Brock had that courage. He had the determination. He led in battle,
Yeah.
which goes back to, the campaign in Holland in 1799, but also at Detroit. He rode up, to the fort and at Queenston Heights when he led the charge. His determination to lead in battle.
And if he
Right?
had doubts
Yeah.
about the ability to defend, he kept them to himself.
Yeah. Yeah. He didn't show that to his
Yes.
men. Now, one of the things that I don't think that we understand fully, and I think you have a quote to back this up, was how immediate his recognition as a hero was. This wasn't, 30 years of history and then people
Yes.
remember, and, history usually gives us 2020, and we reflect, but it wasn't the case with Brock, right? It was almost immediate.
Oh, it was immediate. It was the
Yeah,
same day,
yeah.
virtually. I have a number of quotes there of uh, 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 officers, soldiers who had
Hmm.
engaged in the battle. For example, Captain James Crooks,
Hmm.
who was in the battle, uh, said that his loss was irreparable
Hmm.
and that he had the confidence of the people like nobody else.
Hmm.
Um, Now he's not trying to flatter anybody.
No.
There's no incentive for him to say things like that unless he meant them, and
Hmm.
he's not the only one who says things like that.
Right.
And even there are a couple of American officers who said, with the death of Brock and
Hmm.
his aide de camp Macdonell,
Yeah.
those are the two best British officers
And
already gone.
and on the day of his funeral, they
Oh,
fired a
they
gun salute,
they
didn't they?
fired a
Yeah,
gun salute. That's
yeah,
right. Yes.
yeah.
Uh, and I'm sure it was never been done by an American
By an American.
for a British general.
Yeah, yeah. So we're trying to answer that question. We're trying to answer
Yes,
your
yeah,
astonishing question. And another factor, I think, that people reflect on is, was it our need as
Hmm.
Canadians for a hero? We never really
Hmm.
had one. And the irony, once again, is Brock didn't want to stay in Canada, yet we kind of adopted him. We looked up to him as a
Hmm.
hero.
Well, for Upper Canadians or English-speaking Canadians,
Mm.
they have no hero until 1812. Uh, I mean, you look at, say, previous governors, Simcoe,
Hmm.
Peter Hunter, and so on. Um, they did they they really did nothing heroic. They really did nothing that really impressed the inhabitants that of their leadership or uh, that they deserved, great credit. Brock, on the other hand, died defending
Hmm.
their homes.
Yes.
They realized that.
Yeah.
That's what he was trying to do,
Yeah.
and he was willing to put his life on the line, and it was taken.
And
So immediately there are speeches, there are sermons, there are people write poetry that's published in the newspapers. There are all kinds of newspaper articles, um, and I think it was in March of 1814. The war's still going on.
mm-hmm.
The legislature votes to have a monument to Brock. Um, Upper Canada didn't have a lot of money, and they still had a lot of needs, but they're willing to put some money into
And people
this.
donated, including the
Oh,
indigenous folks.
oh,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
When it came to fundraising,
Yeah.
yes, the donation poured in. Yes,
And that was, just for our viewers, that was the first monument. First monument was
yes.
bombed in 1840. It was erected in 1824. So they had another round of fundraising, and that, right, built another monument, which was dedicated in 1859. So it continues, and that monument is there. I was over on the American side the other week, and it's very prominent. Um, and it continues to this day. At Brock University, there's a statue,
That's right.
which I think is recent. In Ottawa, they
Yes,
have the Valiants or something
yes, that's
statue.
right.
We have Brock University, Brockville, General Isaac Brock Parkway.
Mhm.
It's enduring. It started right away, and it's enduring.
And it wasn't something that
Yeah.
came from official circles,
Yes. Yes.
the
Yeah.
government or the church or whatever.
Yeah.
It seemed to come from the regular people, the
Hmm.
militia,
Hmm.
the soldiers, the indigenous people. They held a ceremony of remembrance later in the year for Isaac Brock and Macdonell, and that was not done for any other British officer in the war.
Hmm. Now,
Amazing tribute.
it's also, and I think we talked before a little bit about this in preparation. There's something Canadian in quote marks about this hero,
Uh,
because we talk about Terry Fox, right? Now, normally when you think about a hero, it's a swashbuckling person who wins a great victory. And we mentioned Terry Fox because here's a guy who's determined, who has courage, and yet died attempting to do his noble deed. It's almost parallel to Brock. Do you think in Canada we've got that different sense of heroes that than other countries have, other nations have?
Maybe at that
Yeah.
period, the 1812, of course, the Americans
Yeah.
had their heroes. The
Yeah.
British had their heroes. You think of Nelson, for
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
um, and Upper Canadians had no heroes.
Mhm.
Now Brock is their hero.
Yeah.
He's uh, he's their own hero. He's not a British hero. He's not an American hero.
Mm.
He's
He's ours.
He's our hero,
Yeah.
you might say,
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
Canadian hero.
Right.
Though of course he wasn't a Canadian,
But he
as you say.
wasn't.
He did want to serve in Europe because that's where promotion would take place. He would have a great career there.
But
But
when he was allowed to go, he
that's right. He said no.
he said no.
This
Yeah.
was on I think it was January of 1812,
1812. Yeah.
and the prospect of war from the United States was very close.
Hmm.
And he decided, well, my duty is to stay here. I've been trying to prepare the province for war.
Hmm.
My duty is to stay here and
Yep.
see it through.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's it's a kind of
Well, how much
nobility.
more Canadian can you get? You know?
Well, I guess yes.
So we kind of tried to unpack that a little bit, and we said
Mhm.
some things like his honorable character and noble qualities, and we've mentioned a couple of examples of that. Um, his family probably contributed to that. He was trained by a Jesuit pastor, I think you said, or he had that kind of
Well,
yeah,
I don't know if it was Jesuit
Jesuit.
pastor, but it was a pastor.
Yeah.
I mean, they
So
were Protestant
early
in their
those
religion.
values of sacrifice and duty
Yes,
and were instilled in him. So
and you could see it with his family too. I think, yeah, his
well
brothers and
his
sisters.
brothers were
Yeah.
also, right? So okay, we have a real Canadian hero. Now, can we can we keep him? We here we are. We've had the bicentennial,
Mhm.
and looking into the future, maybe, because um, heroes need to have a life, and the legacy has to stay alive. Do you think Canadians are going to remain attached? We're in an interesting political situation as we record, right? Do you do
Yes.
you do you think he stands for things that are pretty enduring? The identity of Canada and
Well, good question. At the time, of course, it looked impossible.
mm-hmm,
Such a small population
indeed,
uh, with few resources uh, to defend itself against an overwhelming, much larger. Now,
yeah,
fortunately, um, the American commanders at the beginning were totally incompetent,
correct, yes,
uh,
yeah,
and the administration in Washington wasn't much better, and so um, later on, by 1814, the Americans had developed some good commanders,
mm.
but by then the British could send uh, far more troops, veteran troops, experienced troops from the
Because
north
Napoleon had been right.
that had been
Yeah,
defeated. That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Um, but so, in a way, Brock and Sheaffe
Hmm.
were fortunate in having such poor and poor opponents
Hmm.
who didn't look after their troops. Their troops were not well trained. The militia was discontented, and so on. Um, so it does help to have opponents who really don't know what they're doing.
Hmm. Hmm. Not to take any away from Brock's military ability to plan and,
Yes.
his ability to strategize, which, by the
Yes.
way, I believe also contributed to this because he didn't, he wasn't parachuted in to lead a battle. He was here since 1802
Yes.
and he was, taking care of his men. He was in Lower Canada rather than Upper Canada, but he knew how to, manage a regiment, guard a garrison,
Yes.
look after the men. That no
Yes.
doubt contributed to his ability as a commander. Yeah.
And even in spite of the poor leadership on the American side of the Battle
Mhm.
of Queenston Heights, they did have some good officers. Winfield Scott for one,
Yes. Yeah.
Solomon Van Rensselaer for another,
Yeah.
and there was Captain Wool, I think it is.
Hmm.
So they and they had they had captured an important position, a commanding position. So they weren't totally hopeless opponents. You really this was a battle, and it was hard fighting involved
Indeed.
for the rest of the day.
Indeed. Indeed. And, most of us know how it ended. After Brock died and Sheaffe led the troops in on a circumnavigation
Mm-hmm.
and then confronted them at the top of the escarpment, and there was a couple of volleys, and the Americans surrendered. Um, but once again, our hero Brock didn't survive the battle. Do you think you've answered the question for yourself now that you've written the book and here we are, 10 years or a dozen years later, that the apparent paradoxes, I guess, you know,
Well,
these,
I've tried to answer,
yeah.
but with history, things are always changing. Somebody else can come up with a, a different analysis,
Hmm.
different answers,
Hmm.
raising different questions,
Hmm.
and I hope they do.
Hmm.
This is not the final word by any means
Hmm.
about him, um, but it still, I still felt myself astonished.
Hmm.
Uh, and I've looked at the lives of the other generals he
Generals
commanded
in
in
your the book,
Canada.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
indeed, I looked also at the Napoleonic Wars going on at that time and the kind of commanders, leadership they had then,
Hmm.
um, and those who did have monuments and so on built to them, uh,
But
deserved it.
let's
But
go let's go back to that a little bit because
Mhm.
now our frame of reference is, I mean, other commanders died in battle. I don't know if it was John Moore or Abercrombie or some of these other major generals also died in battle. So people that say, well, it's
Mhm.
because he died in battle, not necessarily. I mean, how does he compare to the other, let's say, generals outside Canada, but in the Napoleonic, let's say, era?
Well, I can't think of any major general who died in battle,
Mm.
but they were exposed to there are several stories of Wellington, for example,
Mm-hmm.
uh, when a battle is taking place, and one of his officers and a horse beside him had his head taken off by
Yeah.
a cannonball. Um,
Or Nelson.
and of
Or
course,
Nelson.
yeah,
Yeah.
Nelson is the great example
Right.
of an officer dying, um, and in a battle that his forces won,
Mm.
and of course, Nelson's column was erected later,
Later than
as we know,
Brock's monument.
but later than that's right.
So we're still kind of there. This guy, this fellow, you know, 200 plus years ago, we're still we're still marveling in a way, right? You know, be- be-
So, so here you have this early population, and still, it's not a wealthy province by any
Mm,
means
yeah.
when they erected this monument. Um, but they went to the expense and the trouble
Mm,
of a competition and got a very qualified architect
mm.
to design it and put the money and time and effort into building that. Um, and it's not a functional thing, it's a symbolic thing. But it was important to the people at the time.
Well, and as I
Uh,
say, they built a second one, and the second one is a little taller, 183 feet, and
yes,
and it's so prominent in the area that we are recording. Um, you can't forget this guy, if you're
yes.
if you're anywhere in this area, and it seems to be right, to justify the legacy and
Uh,
the legend.
And if you visit Brock's Monument,
Yeah,
there are people there who are hired by Parks Canada
right.
and supported by Friends of Fort George
Right.
who will tell you the story of the monument
Mm,
and answer all your questions about it.
mm,
And the site was deliberately chosen
mhm.
to be so prominent and also very uh, visible to
Mhm.
the Americans across the river. A reminder of what happened a long time ago.
What would you say to, let's say, because you were a professor, and there
Mhm.
are, let's say, younger people, hopefully, some of whom are watching our podcast and finding out about Brock, you know, uh, how would you counsel them? What would you say to them? We've kind of given headlines about who the guy was, but
Mhm.
let's say they want to go deeper. What are the things they should be looking for and noting as they read your book, if you like, or
Well, I would
elsewhere?
say visit sites
Yeah.
uh, all over Canada um, and visit museums as well. And you talk to the people there, talk to reenactors.
Mhm.
They're very informative, and they will fill you with all kinds of interesting information. And read books, and I'd be quite happy if you buy my books. But borrow them from the library if you want. But
Yeah.
yes, read the books of Canadian historians.
Yeah.
Uh, they're there's constantly coming out, and really well written. Um, but
And people continue to write about Brock as well as these other people.
yes,
Yeah.
and all the other aspects of the War of 1812. That's right.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say the first place to start is to visit sites, talk to the people, the
That
guides
that
who are
helps you,
there. Yes,
internalize what maybe
and you're
did better
standing at places where things happened.
happened.
Yes.
Yeah, like I know at Queenston Heights, I've been all over that hill,
Hmm.
and this is the spot where Brock fell, or this is the Redan, and they have they have a mock-up of the 18-pounder, I believe it is,
Yes.
that shot against the Americans. So
Yes.
absolutely.
Well, it
Well,
is an actual gun.
oh,
Yes, and
okay.
that's right. Um, and it also shows you can see across the river how close the two sides are,
Yes,
so they could fire at each other with their muskets
that's
even.
right.
Uh, and and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
but also at the same time, before the war and after the war, how people traveled so easily
Hmm.
across the river.
Hmm.
They intermarried, they traded, they were
And
friends.
the war was just a disruption of all of this.
Yes, they were,
Yeah.
and they recognized it as a disruption.
Yes.
They were really upset on both sides
Hmm.
that they were going to be fighting
Yeah.
those friends, those business associates, and so on across the river.
Yeah.
William Hamilton Merritt, who served in the War of 1812 in the militia, married an American woman.
Yes.
Uh,
Catherine Prendergast.
yes, from just across the river,
That's right.
and this was the sort of thing
Yeah.
that went on.
Yeah.
Uh, so it showed uh, what's the word I'm trying to think of here,
Closeness,
the, the
proximity,
closeness, and
neighborly.
um, this is an unnecessary war in many
Mm,
ways.
mm,
Oh, but
hmm.
it happened, and so you have to deal with it.
But it's almost like saying, and I think we had another guest at the on the podcast, and we said, well, we got it out of our system. Families also, brothers and sisters and siblings, they always fight. We've had our little fight, all right? And now it's done. It's long ago, and we can continue being friends and family. So,
Well, that's a good point. The
yeah,
Treaty of Ghent, which brought an end to the war, is still in effect,
yes,
and it's one of the peace treaties that have lasted probably longer than any other peace treaty. If you
yes.
think of peace treaties that
Interesting.
ended the First World War
Yes,
or the Second World War,
yeah,
well, the First World War, those peace treaties hardly lasted,
mm,
a decade or so, and many other wars that you can think of, um, which were settled by peace treaties, and they didn't last.
yeah,
The Treaty of Ghent has lasted and still in effect. It was, I think, one of the best treaties,
mm,
peacemaking treaties,
mm,
in many ways, uh, though in other ways it was not.
mm.
But it meant no future wars between the United States
It's
and
in Canada,
Britain
or
and
Great Britain
Canada.
and Canada,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Canada at the time.
sure, involving Canada.
Yeah. Well, thank you
Yes.
for this. I mean, we've gone a little bit from Brock, but we've
Mm,
gone to the
mm,
wider remembrance of this war and this time, and I think the importance to remember it, because
good.
it's
Hmm.
it's relevant today, you know,
Yes, yeah, I think it continues to be
and
relevant.
it continues to
Yes.
be relevant in our lives today. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on this episode of the Stories of 1812 podcast. Our guest has been Professor Wesley Turner, who has written, once again, two books. One called The Astonishing General, and the other is The British Generals in the War of 1812, among his other books. Should you wish to pursue some of the topics we talked about today, we'll see you next time. Our website is storiesof1812.com. Want to thank Jim Valen of Valen Entertainment for doing the technical work here. And thank you for joining us. See you next time.